Welcome to a new episode of Film Seizure at the Movies. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the Film Seizure podcast that you can catch each Wednesday morning with my cohorts Jason Oliver and Chuck Moore, and my solo show Monster Mondays that you can listen to each Monday afternoon. You can catch both of those shows at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Gosh, it's been a bit since I've done one of these, but, I guess life gets in the way. But anyway, for this episode, I am talking about the latest from Marvel Studios, Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania. This is the start of Phase 5 of the Marvel Studios films. Allow me to explain. Marvel Studios head Kevin Feige has long phased the films and TV shows that came and went. For example, Phase 1 was to set the stage for the cinematic universe, introduce our primary heroes of Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, the Hulk, Hawkeye, and Black Widow, and have them ultimately join together as the Avengers. Phase 2 was the expansion of the cinematic universe and the impact of the Avengers on the world at large. Phase 3 was ultimately lead to the conclusion of the Avengers story and dispose of the main baddie of this entire first saga, if you will, that was Thanos. Now, the first three phases were collectively called the Infinity Saga, as they all dealt with Thanos obtaining the Infinity Stones. Phase 4 has been a bit rocky for some people. With the Avengers a thing of the sort of past, it now was used to start introducing new characters and legacy characters. We saw Black Widow get her solo shot at a movie that actually takes place earlier than Avengers Infinity War, which was somewhere in the middle of Phase 3, but sets up Florence Pugh's Yelena as the next person to take up the mantle of Black Widow. We met Shang-Chi. The Eternals widened the scope of the cosmic side of the Marvel Universe. A new Vision was created in WandaVision. Another Loki survived the events of his death in the main universe. And Black Panther saw the mantle pass to the sister. In addition to all of that, Loki, Spider-Man, and Doctor Strange dealt heavily with the multiverse, the literal endless possibilities of different timelines and situations that could occur in the grand scheme of Marvel's existence. Thus, Phase 4 kicked off what's now being called the Multiverse Saga. The main baddie of this phase? Well, Kang the Conqueror, played by Jonathan Majors. We got a sneak peek of Majors in this role of sorts as He Who Remains in the first season of Loki. Now, I'm a big fan of Kang the Conqueror. This goes back to me being introduced to the character as a small lad with Secret Wars. What's interesting is that I probably had his figure made by Mattel before I actually read all of the Secret Wars story. That those figures were made for. But when I really got my first exposure to comics, Kang was the villain of a Roger Stern, John Buscema arc of The Avengers in 1986. Something about his blue face and green and sometimes magenta, sometimes pink, most of the time purple outfit, and those far out thigh-high go-go boots of his just kind of spoke to me, I guess. But he just was a character that stuck with me. I always knew who Kang was. I always knew that he had multiple aliases. He's also known as Immortus, who had his first appearance in the Avengers comic shortly after Kang did way back in the mid-60s. He also had the alias of Rama Tut, who gave the Fantastic Four fits. He so prolifically messed around with the time stream trying to conquer everything that he's all kinds of split up as these different variations of himself. In fact, they even say in this movie that he doesn't live his life linearly. But he's kind of the perfect character to lead the villainy of this new saga of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He's kind of messed with just about everyone at some point. Because he's appeared in an early issue of the Fantastic Four, his specter is a perfect thing to be felt over this saga that will ultimately introduce that team to the cinematic universe. He's messed about with the X-Men, so more and more mutants will also start to appear thanks to this saga. However, I got to go back to my favorite run of comics ever, and that's Kurt Busiek and his amazing time spent on the Avengers book in the late 90s and early aughts. Between Roger Stern's use of Kang and Busiek's, we're going to see a lot of these two guys' concepts play into the movies coming out from Marvel. Stern introduced the idea of the Council of Kangs, which was the myriad of Kangs that were split up throughout the multiverse and all those different timelines that he messed with. That's something that was already hinted at in that Loki TV show, because the Kang we're likely to be fighting against will be the one that all the others wanted to make sure never got out into the multiverse or out into the universe again, among other things that you will see in this movie. I won't give away all the spoilers here, but and then there's the final arc that Busiek ever wrote for the Avengers, the Kang Dynasty, and that happens to be the name of the next Avengers movie, by the way. That was a story in which Kang completely outmaneuvered the Avengers by creating multiple troubles that ultimately forced the Avengers to be split up, and then boom, he arrived to force his hand and force the Avengers to surrender. That was a great story. It was emotional, it was exciting, bad things happened. Ultimately, the Avengers had to summon up everything they had to win. So it makes a great Avengers book, and boy howdy did Busiek go out with a bang. And it's just one of those things that just, it was one of those things that I would buy the new issue, and before I even drove away, I would read that issue in the car before I would even leave. I couldn't wait to get home to read it. That was good stuff. That's what makes a great comic book. Now, to finally get Kang the Conqueror into a Marvel movie or TV show, well, that's something I can 100% get behind. So let's talk about Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. For the most part, I found this to be a pretty fun movie. Certainly the second and third acts are where this movie shines. If I compare this movie only to the previous Ant-Man movies, this one is far more interesting in the sense that the quantum realm, where pretty much 90% of this movie takes place, is made up of a kind of patchwork variation of different looks and terrains and so forth. And in addition, Kang is by far the most high-stakes villain that Ant-Man has ever had to deal with in his own movies. And we'll come back around to Jonathan Majors and his portrayal of Kang momentarily. But one of the things that has turned some people off to some of the wackier movies of the Marvel Cinematic Universe these last couple of years has been the previous Thor movies or the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. And that's the use of comedy. Now, Ant-Man has always kind of had a good handle on that in this quote-unquote trilogy. We're going to refer to it as that just because I don't think there's any other better way of saying these are three movies that Ant-Man has his name on. But it's helpful that you have this character who has been a loser and kind of down on his luck and struggles as a single dad who, as a hero, most of the time turns into a teeny tiny guy, or sometimes he's a super giant, slow moving, kind of booming voice kind of guy that you know has some comedy around that too. So you're already starting from an angle or perspective that is just simply kind of silly. But then you have an extremely charismatic actor like Paul Rudd playing the guy that you almost kind of have to like. But that really good handling of the mix of comedy and the seriousness is where Paul Rudd shines a little better than some of the other leads in the MCU have. Rudd seems far more natural at being funny and that lovable loser type, while also being able to appropriately shift gears towards some of the more serious and kind of tender moments with his daughter, played in this by Catherine Newton. And it just works. Another thing that works really well is the relationship between the characters, and in particular, the relationship between Rudd Scott, Newton's Cassie, and Michael Douglas playing Hank Pym. Those three in particular seem to kind of work off each other and almost naturalistically as three generations of a family, quote unquote. I wouldn't necessarily say that Evangeline Lilly has a whole lot to do as Hope Van Dyne, aka the Wasp, you know, the co-lead of this whole movie. And my biggest complaint actually comes in the form of Janet Van Dyne, played by Michelle Pfeiffer. Now, these issues I have are neither Lily nor Pfeiffer's faults. Lily has almost nothing to do except for one small thing in the climax. Leading up to that, she's there, she says things, she bickers with her mother, she seemingly is a good potential stepmom to Cassie. She seems to be successful outside of her Wasp persona. But we don't really see nearly enough of her or what makes her this kind of strong figure that Scott tells us in the opening narration. We'd have benefited if Douglas and Pfeiffer were not inserted into the main bulk of the movie, but maybe instead been outside trying to help the other three inside the quantum realm fight against Kang, and therefore that would have increased Lily's Hope character's profile in this. However, the biggest issue I have, without a doubt, is with Pfeiffer's Janet Van Dyne. Look, I love Janet. I love her as an incredible comic book character who has gone from being a universe savior to leader of the Avengers to a really interesting female character who has dealt with spousal abuse. And thankfully, none of that last point, that spousal abuse stuff, will ever be, that will never be seen in these movies. However, here we spend the entirety of the first act of this movie with her telling us that something bad is waiting in the quantum realm and kind of refusing to talk about what happened in the 30 years that she was in the quantum realm and so on. Even the slightest bit of information would have likely not allowed for anything in this movie to happen. Now, granted, the movie has to happen, so we are now stuck with one of the biggest sins a movie could have in my book. A character who holds a lot of very important information refusing to share said information even after potentially really bad things have happened or are starting to happen. She knows who Kang is. She has a ton of information about why it is vitally important that the quantum realm not be messed with whatsoever. She refuses to tell anyone this. And some of it is trauma. I understand that, like she's not proud of the stuff that, she's not proud of the fact that she helps Kang at one point in the past, and therefore it creates this a whole domino effect of really bad things. But she really becomes the entire driving force around anything and everything bad that happened, is happening, or could happen with Kang. She could have cut her losses with just accepting that she allowed for bad things to happen. At least, once she realizes that bad things happen or will happen, she doesn't really fully know what she's helped him to do, but she could cut her losses after that and just say, I feel guilty for not realizing that this guy is bad news from the beginning. And then, she could just accept that she allowed those things to happen, or can feel guilty for those things happening, and then let her family know that the really bad things that went down and why they can't be repeated and why you can't go mucking about with this entire realm. So instead, we get Scott and Cassie beating themselves up over things that happen and that could happen. These things happen in this movie, and I was so frustrated because Scott saying, "Oh, it's my fault that things happen," and Cassie says, "No, it's my fault things happen." I'm like, no, it's neither of your fault, because you had a character who knew everything and refused to tell you. That's a sin. And when it comes to storytelling, you can't just have a character know things and then refuse to give that information and still be looked at as a decent character, or at least a character that you can trust as a viewer, or as the third party kind of watching things unfold. It kind of makes Michelle Pfeiffer's character out kind of to be a bad guy, and that sucks. But Another good thing is, as is the case with Phase 4 of the MCU, Phase 5 kicks off with the introduction of a new young hero. Now, that's Cassie Lang, who will ultimately become the hero from the comics known as Stature. Now, some might feel that the addition of new characters over the course of the previous phase felt a little shoehorned in, but you'd have to make a very serious case that I absolutely cannot disagree with to say that maybe more than a single character of those younger generation characters were truly quote-unquote shoehorned in with nothing really to do to affect the show or movie that they appeared in. But here, I think that Catherine Newton is good as Cassie. She kind of has this near wide-eyed and slightly naive sense of do-goodery. It's kind of baked into her character from the first moment that we see her in this. And there's something that she tells MODOK that kind of changes his mind about what he's doing. And it's in a way kind of saccharine and really kind of overly sweet, but it's kind of done in a charming way. And it does lead to a little bit of a chuckle. And MODOK, if you know who that is and what he is, it's great to see that in the live action movie because that was a completely bonkers concept from the comics that you'd have never thought could appear in the flesh, but he does here. So that was fun. And whenever MODOK shows up, either you're all in on that character or it's going to really bother you. Now, ultimately, it's Jonathan Majors that is just the best part of this movie. He's fantastic as Kang. He pretty much steals the show here. I mean, one could say that this entire movie is a vehicle to just simply introduce Kang, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you. However, Majors is kind of chilling in how he just kind of calmly explains that he plans to wipe out trillions upon trillions of lives in the infinite multiverse to bring order to chaos. He plainly states that he is a conqueror. He lacks sympathy while trying to prey on people's compassion, particularly for their loved ones. He's a cold villain and shows off his power set sparingly but viciously. This is a really good performance and one that will constantly shift as there is a multiverse of Kangs that might make appearances over the next several movies and years. So in conclusion, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania is at best kind of middle of the road Marvel Cinematic Universe stuff, maybe lower end of that middle group. Where it really excels is the interesting characters that show up in the quantum realm, and that cold performance from Majors is, that alone is top tier. Paul Rudd is perfectly fine. You get exactly what you expect from him in that. I do like Catherine Newton. There's some good scenes that involve Michael Douglas too. The setting of the quantum realm, it's good stuff. But the massive strike against it is the Janet Van Dyne holding information back from our other characters until really bad things start to unfold that would have been really helpful to know beforehand. There's a lesser strike against the lack of things to do for Evangeline Lilly's Hope character that is just a real shame for someone whose name is in the title of the movie. I'm not sure if you even straighten out those two strikes that it would launch the movie into the top tier. It would certainly, though, move it up to be among maybe the better movies of that middle group if those things were fixed. But I think it is safe to say that if you like Marvel movies, you're going to see this one anyway. If you've got a passing interest in the MCU or you liked how the Loki TV series ended with Majors revealing a version of Kang there, then you might enjoy this one as well. For me, it's a perfectly fine Marvel movie that doesn't quite reach rarefied air in the entire series. But That does it for this episode. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram so you can be made aware of new episodes of our various shows as they drop. You can also follow us at podcast providers like SoundCloud, Google Podcast, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spotify, and Audible. You can also listen to the show on YouTube, and you can subscribe to all of those places and be notified when those new episodes come out. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with my review of Creed 3, so until then, don't forget to save me the aisle seat.